but the way the school community thinks about the principal's role as well, because we've got to find ways to make the job of the school principal more on a human scale. And we have expectations of school principals that we would never have for similar types of managerial leaders in different industries. You know, when was the last time you called your doctor's office and expected to talk to the doctor on the phone without an appointment or any advance notice? We don't do that, but we routinely expect that of our school principals, and for them to be available and have the information to solve those problems, you know. And so there's a shift that needs to take place in our expectations and our understanding of what the principal is if we want distributed leadership models to really work effectively.
Thank you. I'd like to press a little harder on this issue of the selection of principals. In Kentucky, we've had an issue lingering in the legislature about how school councils select principals. Our organization has lobbied on behalf of superintendents having a greater role and got a bill passed to that effect a year or two ago. Jefferson County, I think, Franklin has some special issues there about how principals are selected for distressed schools. What is your impression of how we can advance that? The selection of the right folks for leadership roles.
Well, prior to selection, I think development is really important. So before we get to the point of selecting, we should make sure that we provide a lot of different experiences and leadership opportunities, whether it's on the distributed leadership team or on the instructional leadership council, so that people have some practice and experience. And leaders, they go through a very extenuous process of selection, which we do jointly with the school district, but the school districts we work in, and the leaders is in 5 regions of the country. I'm in the South region, but we work very hard to try to, you know, do everything from sort of in-basket activities to looking at the results that they've had in the past in terms of the selection. And then I think that once you select people, then you really have to continuously invest. I think Tennessee looked at the principals that had been selected back in, I think, 2013. And of the principals selected, about 1/3 of all the principals in the state of Tennessee had been hired within the last 3 years. And so, and then 68% of the principals that were recently appointed had been assistant principals. And about 1/3 of them, about 20% of them had been teachers and went right into the principalship across the whole state. So I think that it's really important that we define the skills and the knowledge we want people to have. We develop programs and partnerships with other people to make sure that they have some of those experiences in advance. And then again, I'm a strong advocate for them having some residency experience before they get thrown into this with a very talented principal, so that they get to practice the difficulty. This is a tough job, being a school leader. It's very demanding. It has lots of aspects to it if you're going to see substantial improvement. And I think what we heard from the speaker, Dr. Puckney, yesterday, Kentucky is not looking for getting to proficiency. You think proficiency is a low bar. You want to make sure that you're at the advanced and above level of competition. And to get to that really requires a whole different level of, I think, leadership at the school level.
College of Education design teams really need to respond quickly to teacher leadership in having them fast track into the administrative world. Teacher leaders get it here in Kentucky. We fall short within our educational departments to support them. With many respects, we're still dealing with old programming, with coursework, curriculum. And it is a challenge right now, but I think that our state is positioned to respond to the leadership that's coming, grassroots. I feel like that through the clinical work to open up our schools to that type of potential, it's not just necessary. We're losing time. And I feel like that, again, our shared vision, our shared efforts will get our College of Education to truly reset, revamp, and really lead in those areas.
Ron? I'm Gary.
I would just say I support the position of KESS and KESA that the role of the superintendent needs to be strengthened in principal hiring. I can't think of any other industry where a person is responsible for evaluating an employee that they only had a limited hand in selecting for that role, or not at all. And so I think there are a lot of ways that effective superintendents can engage the community in the selection process. But at the end of the day, I think our current system really ties the hands of superintendents in significant ways to select the right people particularly for high-need schools.
A few superintendents have approached us at the chamber with the idea of creating a cohort within our institute for aspiring principals. Aspiring principals. And would we be interested? And we've said, well, yes and no. Yes, we would be willing to do that. We're thinking about trying that next year. But we've said to the superintendents, we're not where we want to be yet with putting forward enough opportunities for principals themselves. As I mentioned a while ago, we'd like to double our numbers of principals going through our program. So if the superintendents would be willing to write the check for an aspiring, seriously, if they would be willing to fund that, we'd put together a cohort, of course. So that's kind of where that is in the discussion stage right now. I'm also reminded by some of your responses on the selection of principals. In the business community, there's a growing trend toward using the social sciences and various methods to evaluate or at least come to understand the social intelligence of a particular job candidate before you hire them. Billy Harper was on the selection committee when I was invited to come back to Kentucky and take the position that I'm in now, and they said, go online, fill out this form, we'll see how you match up with our expectations. And it's a bing, 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 10 minutes later, and there's all this data that is run through the computer models as to whether or not I would be a match for what they were looking for. Big data is being used by a lot of companies to decide whether or not somebody is a particular match. Is there any of that going on in the education community where there's fairly sophisticated professional assessment of the emotional quotient, I don't know what you would call it, goes beyond Myers-Briggs and that sort of thing, to see whether or not a person has those skills that you need to lead a faculty? Any thoughts?
Prior to coming to WKU, I was the district administrator in the Simpson County Schools. And for many years, they have used a whole battery of personality assessments and aptitude assessments with applicants for teaching positions and especially for administrative positions. And it's an interesting process. At no point is a person ever disqualified because of a particular score on a particular assessment, but the goal is to get a richer picture of who the person is and how they might function within the context for which they are being considered. And so I think, based on my experience with that and what I understand from that district, it greatly contributes to their understanding of their candidates and better hiring decisions in the long run.
We use that with all the candidates for positions in our shop now, and I have learned through painful experiences that if we're wrong and go against what we're seeing in those evaluations, we're really wrong. And you don't see that after 2 hours of an interview. So anyhow, I think we're ready to kind of open it up to the audience here to quiz these folks on. Thank you, Bill. You have a question?
Yes.
There's a microphone behind you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not used to microphones don't work anyhow, but anyhow. You got it. Is it green?
Projectors.
There you go.
The question I have is it relates to principal training and teacher training or any type of school training. Do you all know of any type of training, or is it part of any curricula, cross-cultural training?
There are dimensions of cultural proficiency that we build into our administrative preparation program. I can't speak to pre-service teacher training. Julia or Mary might be able to speak to that. But I know we do integrate elements of cultural proficiency into our coursework. That is another component of our redesign. So as our candidates are going to work in diverse school settings, sometimes much more diverse than what they themselves have been a product of, and so we want to make sure that that is built into their training program as well in a more effective way and more thorough way than we're currently doing.
It is integrated into new leaders, but I think all of our programs fall short of the kind of preparation that helps really prepare people for the real world that they're going to confront in our schools, particularly our schools that are becoming much more diverse, both racially and linguistically and economically. So I think it is an area that we have to continue to find ways, and we tend to bring in external partners to help deliver that portion of the curriculum, but I think it increasingly needs to be addressed. And one point that I was going to make just in the last question was about in Jacksonville, Florida, the superintendent has selected kind of a handful of 20 assistant principals that he's prioritized above all the other as, you know, in a pipeline. And so we're developing them. They're not principals yet, but he sees them as instructional leaders potentially if they get the right training. And those folks we're taking through some more extensive work around cultural competency because it is in a larger urban district.
Bill, follow-up comment or anything? Okay, great. Scott Davis from Henderson, who, by the way, rounds up money in Henderson to send principals through our program. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the segue into my question. So, Dr. Johnson, you touched on the need to have partnerships between the broader community and the school system. Do you see specific models, communities that are really strong with collaboration, what they're doing in communities, the private sector that come alongside the school system to assist with leadership development for not only principals but emerging leadership? Places we can look to, you think that here's a good example of collaboration?
Well, I think that clearly I'm in Memphis, so we do have lots of partners that we collaborate with, much like you're describing here, to support the leadership development work that we're going to do. Some of it's philanthropic support. Some of it's we have an advisory board in New Leaders in Memphis, and they are made up mostly of business leaders and people who are just interested in improving the opportunities for school leaders, but also teacher leaders. I think that Kentucky is fortunate to have a lot of interest in education in the both philanthropic and business community, and I think that's been in place for quite a long time, and I think that's been true at least in some parts of Tennessee where we have these partnerships. But I think school superintendents, school board members, and others have to be open, right, and transparent, and be willing to share the data that we have about what's working and what's not working. And I think there is a reluctance.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's often the challenge, is that transparency factor to let somebody from the outside in.
We do have better data than we've ever had before. It's much more public than it's ever been before. I've looked at some of your progress in Jefferson County on the NAEP scores, and it's been pretty impressive. So I think we have much more data to look at, and increasingly, when we can be honest about things, I think that the community is willing to step forward. I think they have to see that we're willing to change, that it's not just the status quo.
You know, I bragged on Henderson and Scott down there. Let me give you a practical example of how some of that collaboration has come together in Hopkinsville. Down there, through their chamber and through specifically a banker, Elizabeth McCoy down there, she has a reception at her home. Their goal is to raise enough money by passing the hat at that reception to guarantee that every year Hopkinsville Christian County will have 2 principals available if accepted into the leadership program. So they've made that commitment. After the principal goes through, the Chamber of Commerce introduces them at their monthly breakfast, brags on them, shows them to the community, brags on the sponsors, the newspaper's there, gets pictured, big thing in the newspaper about the principal going through. That kind of recognition, I think, means something to most people. And so that's where the media, the business community, a banker, and the school leadership come together to celebrate some good things going on. Other questions? Right back there. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to be the person who always says, so you talked about the community and involving the community. Define the community and give us some idea how you are including families. I volunteer in 2 priority schools as just a reading volunteer. And one of the things that I find the principals really struggling with is how do I incorporate families to the point that families want to work with us and want to come alongside and be partners with us. So is that something that shows up in the preparation of principals?
Jennifer, you've done something, haven't you?
We have. I think the key to that is to give families a real reason to be engaged, a real reason to be involved, and not just ask for them to, show up on a given night for a family event. So our shared leadership teams are really doing a good job of tapping the talents of our folks in our community, of our families, and asking them to come to the table and help us to analyze our data, help us to plan a path moving forward. But just within our cooperative, all the different things that we have going on, family engagement is a really big piece of that. And probably the biggest area that we have family engagement is around that area of health and wellness. In our region, we have